All right.
Hello, everybody. Thank you
Hello,
so
hello.
much for joining us for this winter segment of our seasonal cooking workshops. My name is Sarah Edlin, and I'm an educator here at the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Dawson. I'm an educator and farmer here at the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center. Happy that you're joining us today.
Yeah. So the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center is an education project located at Stone Acres Farm in Stonington, Connecticut. Our mission is to connect people to each other and to where their food comes from through food and farm-based education. This workshop is part of a year-long series of professional development workshops for family and consumer science teachers and others. It's designed to support the work that FCS teachers do with their students to educate them about the food system. I want to take a moment to thank both the Connecticut Grown for Connecticut Kids program and the USDA Farm to School program for their generous grants that we've received that make it possible for us to create these and other resources that we think teachers will find useful in their classrooms. You can find recordings and resources for all of our workshops on our website at yellowfarmhouse.org. This fall, we did workshops on poultry farming, buying locally, and breads and grains. And you can watch those videos and look at those resources now. And then once we're done with this presentation, this workshop will be available for you to view or share with others.
Yeah.
And you'll also find on our website the workshop schedule and information about how to register for spring workshops that are upcoming, including a really interesting one on seeds, one on dairy farming and bees and honey, and many, many more interesting topics.
Yeah, that should be really cool.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to all of it. So we're so pleased to be having this conversation about winter food with you today. We're going to be talking about and thinking about what's available to cook with in the winter. So first, my colleague Eric is going to be taking us on a walk with Peter Higgins, who's one of the farmers here at Stone Acres. And they're going to be talking about what's happening on our farm this winter. And then we're going to have a talk with Matt Durham, who's another educator here at the Yellow Farmhouse. And he's going to share his knowledge of the cold hardy and storage crops that we're still able to grow and sell here at the farm. And then finally, we'll see what's available in our farm stand today and think about how we could use those ingredients to make a hearty winter meal. So let's go to Eric and Pete.
Cool. Let's toss that up. Hi everyone, my name is Eric Dawson and I work for the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center. Even though it is winter, it doesn't really look like winter here out on the farm, as you can see. But today we're going to talk to some of the farmers here at Stone Acres and see what's really going on during the winter months here.
Hello everybody, I'm Pete. I'm one of the farmers at Stone Acres. Today we're going to talk about what a day looks like in the winter and some of the other projects that we have going on throughout the whole season.
Cool. So what does a typical day look like for you during the winter months?
We usually start in here. We kind of rendezvous, get a nice fire going, have somewhere to come and warm up. And then we have a whole list of projects that we laid out earlier in the winter, and we slowly just try to chisel away at them one by one.
Gotcha. Awesome. So what types of projects are you guys working on right now?
A lot of things go on around the greenhouses. So in the summertime, you can't really be taking the plastic off or putting it back on. But when winter comes around and there's nothing growing in them, it's a great time to sort of address any problems that you couldn't solve throughout the summer.
Gotcha. So I know one example would be like replacing the greenhouse plastic.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the sort of purpose of that?
Yeah, the greenhouses, they do take a beating over the years, and you just need to replace the outside of them just like anything.
So Pete, how do you guys plan and get your seeds for the winter and for the rest of the farm year?
So every year we have to put in a pretty big seed order. It usually happens, you think about it throughout the entire winter and you finish it up in late winter, early spring, put your order in and everything will arrive. We keep everything inside this fridge because it's a constant cool temperature and it's also very dry, which is also important for seeds. For winter, the main focus is cold hardiness. So we plant things like spinach, arugula, mustard greens, and other things that can tolerate the cold, because you're always going to get one stretch in the winter time that's usually 15 or 20 degrees, and most plants don't survive through that. Things like spinach and mustard greens, those will keep going even in very cold temperatures. We'll see that later in the big tunnel. But when you think about the rest of the season, we break everything down into blocks in the field, and so we know specifically how much seed to buy to fill a certain block. Obviously there's things that take a lot longer, tomatoes, Brussels sprouts, so those are going to be taking up extended periods of time in the field, whereas something like a head lettuce may only take up 60 days or 70 days. And so we kind of look at things with days to maturity, which means how long does it take to go from seed to harvestable and in our farm stand. And that dictates most of the selection that goes on. And then, so after you look at days to maturity, we usually focus on what did well last year, what didn't do well last year, and we move from there depending on what we think will be beneficial for the following year.
Cool.
Besides vegetables here at Stone Acres, we also raise chickens and turkeys. Right now we have chickens here on the farm, so let's talk to Pete and go check him out.
All right.
Hey,
All
Pete.
right, so we're here with our laying hens. Their main thing that they do on this farm is lay eggs for us, but they also serve other purposes. If you look at this field, you can see there was old rows here. We had cabbage and broccoli here previously, and if you look at them right now, they ruffle around, they eat a lot of the seeds, and they also poop on it, which is actually pretty beneficial for the soil. It's known as pasturing a field plot. So what they're doing now over many different months will make the soil very rich and full of nutrients that the vegetables that we put here next year will love to grow. So what we can do with the chickens is move them from this field block to that field block and slowly rotate them around. And so you get two different things from your laying hens, where you get the eggs from them, and then you also get the other benefit of having them improve your soil fertility over time.
Do the chickens still lay eggs even when it's this cold outside?
Definitely. It certainly slows down. They won't be laying as much as they will in the summertime, but as long as you keep them warm enough and keep them well fed, their egg production still stays pretty good.
Good to know. Thank you. So now we've made it up to one of our high tunnels that we have here on the farm. So let's go check it out and see what's inside. Already you can feel a major temperature difference when it comes to just the temperature that we're feeling inside here compared to outside. So I'm gonna turn it over to Pete. Tell us what we got going on in here.
All right, welcome to our big tunnel. This is one of our largest covered spaces. We really try to utilize it as much as we can in the winter time. And like Eric mentioned, it can get up to be 60, 70 degrees if it's a nice sunny day and it's maybe above 30 or 40 outside, which really keeps the plants alive. But the main thing, we can get it as warm as possible in here, but the main thing that we can't change is the amount of sunlight every single day. So we go through a period of time where plants really start to slow down and they don't grow too much. So a big part of winter farming is making sure that you have your crops in early enough, like maybe end of October, early November, so that they can get enough sunlight to get a head start and begin to grow. But once everything's established and it stays warm enough, we hand pick this spinach in a way that encourages it to continually grow back. So as soon as this spinach will last here we'll probably be picking until March when it's about time to come out and something else will be introduced into here. We also have a long row of arugula. Now arugula is one of those things that is not as cold hardy as spinach or some other varieties of mustard green, and we can show that eventually that couldn't sustain a 10 or 12 degree night. So we had a stretch of 10, 12, 15 degrees, and you'll see where the arugula it got burned. And that just means that it really stopped growing because of the cold. Whereas spinach is a crop that's extremely hardy and it can grow through pretty much anything. So you can see a lot of the arugula here. Some of it just could not sustain the cold, and that's to be expected. That's just part of growing things in the winter time. But fortunately, there's always a few good pieces that make it out. So this is another thing that we can go through. We can pick it by hand. It's a little more time consuming, but at the end of the day, we still have some nice arugula.
We are back outside our big high tunnel here. We're in one of our growing fields right next to it. And now let's find out what we had growing in here over the summer.
All right, so what you see now looks like grass, but what it actually is a rye cover crop. The main reason you put a cover crop down is to hold the soil tight. It goes against any erosion that might happen on. There's other cover crops that can also be beneficial to soil fertility. And when you mow this and you kind of reintroduce it into the field, it's going to be more organic matter for the year, which is always a good thing. And so this is a pretty big change from 6 months ago. You can still kind of see the remnants of where our squash and watermelons were. So we had butternut squash, kabocha squash, acorn squash, and a couple different kinds of watermelons. Butternut squash is a great example of a storage crop. So that's another big part of winter, is slowly harvesting all of your crops that can be stored for a long period of time. And what needs to happen is a curing process. So what we do is we leave them in sort of a warmer, sunny area, and they kind of sweat out any extra moisture that they have in them. And what that's going to do is allow them to keep for a long amount of time. And we'll bring them into a basement or a cooler, which we'll talk about later. All right, what we're standing on now is our garlic patch. It may just look like a bunch of leaves, but underneath here you have lots of cloves that are planted in the ground individually. And so these need to be put into the ground around early November. And what happens is they experience a period of dormancy through the cold, but you put a nice big pile of mulch on top of them, and then when it begins to get warm enough, they know it's time to grow. And you can see a little one beginning to grow here. Eventually this will get up to be 4 feet tall, and you get a nice big head of garlic under there. But this is an example of one of our crops that actually grows. It doesn't necessarily grow over the winter, but it's planted before winter time. It makes it through the winter, and then it decides when it's ready to begin growing come summertime.
All right, so we are back down here on the main part of Stone Acres Farm. So Pete, what are we standing in front of right now?
This is a walk-in that we just recently built. So when you think about storage crops, things like this are really essential for being able to keep your things throughout the winter time. What we look for when we're storing storage crops is consistent, cool temperatures, and that wherever area they're in is also very dry, because any moisture is going to encourage those crops to begin to rot, and that's the last thing that we want to happen. All right, and here is our walk-in that is full of storage crops right now. In here still, so it's January today. We still have rutabaga, we still have carrots, we still have butternut squash. All of those things can last very long throughout the winter, which is a huge part of what we do here. If you want to come in, we can show you some more how we store the crops specifically. So here you can see a fresh bin of carrots. It's still fresh despite being harvested in November time. If you bit into this carrot, it would have a delicious snap. We store them dirty like this because it actually will eat up a lot of the extra moisture that's in the bin, and it really slows down any decomposition that might happen to our carrots.
All right, Pete, thanks for spending some time with us this morning. To finish off, I just have one question for you. What is one thing that you would want people to know about farming in Connecticut during the winter time?
The main thing, so what I always think of as winter rolls around first is how cold it is. And while that's a huge factor in what we do and what we can grow, the amount of daylight that you get for every given day in the wintertime is probably your biggest limiting factor. So there's a period of time that has been coined the Persephone period, and that lasts until about the end of November to the middle of January. And when we're in that period, plants really slow down and they can't grow because the basis of plant growth is based off of photosynthesis, and that comes from sunlight. So when you get a huge reduction throughout the winter time, it makes plants really slow down, and that's probably the most difficult thing that we have to go through when it comes to winter farming.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, that's so great. I love seeing all that perspective of the farm from the farmer himself.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much more going on in the winter than like what you might see just like if you came to the farm right now. It doesn't really look like much, but there's so much like active work still happening.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I've been wondering what that stripped down high tunnel was, like what was going on over there. But I guess they're just replacing the plastic.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
Yeah. I'd like to go sit by that fire some morning. I'd like to start my day out at a fire.
Right? It seems like a pretty good way to start your day.
Oh, and I was thinking next week we're going to have all those teachers on campus. Maybe we'll take them up to the high tunnel and taste some of that spinach.
I will say it's quite good.
So now we're going to go find our colleague Matt on the microfarm, and he's going to share some of his knowledge about the food that is still being grown, like the greens we saw in the high tunnels, as well as the storage crops that we're still able to sell here because they've been curing for a while.
All right.
All right, so we're here in the garden at Stoneacres Farm. I'm Sarah Edlin, and this is Matt Donham. We are the
educators here at Yellow Farmhouse.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit about farming in the winter here at Stoneacres. So let's start. I'm going to ask Matt, what are some of the major points about cold hardy plants?
Right. So when we're talking about cold hardy plants, we're usually talking about your smaller sort of leafy greens like arugula, spinach, kale, mustard greens, collard greens, things like that. And that's because in the wintertime, it's more about less daylight hours and plants don't have a chance to photosynthesize as much, right? So you can think about temperature being one factor, but the number of hours of sunlight being a major factor. And a good example to think about would be trees going dormant in the wintertime. They're not necessarily dying. They're just not wasting their energy making food when there's not so much as an abundance of sun that's going to fuel photosynthesis, right? So they're dropping their leaves, they're going dormant, there's not as much sunlight, and we can grow those smaller, leafier greens that might not require as much sun as other plants. And you can also think about it in the sense that those plants that I mentioned before, we're not harvesting the fruit off of them or seeds or flowers like we would with other crops like a tomato or a pepper, for instance. We're just primarily harvesting the leaves or an immature flower like we would in the case of a broccoli. So we're thinking about plants like spinach, arugula, kale, collards. Those are all brassicas or cruciferous vegetables. Cruciferous refers to those plants when they do make a flower, has a cross-shaped flower, and those vegetables are bred from the same wild plant, and we've bred them for different purposes based on the things that we want to eat, right? So for broccoli, we're trying to eat the flowers. Kale, we're eating the leaves. Kohlrabi, we're eating the stem. So we've bred all of those plants that can withstand lower temperatures in the winter time, and we've bred those different pieces of the plant that we want to eat. And those plants also are going to thrive in a less pesty environment, which you would see in the winter when there's less pressure from insects and things like that.
Oh, that's interesting. And so how do these plants differ from the plants that thrive in the summer?
Yeah, so if you could think about, I like to think about this in sort of the opposite, right? So if you tried to grow these plants in the heat of summer, they would not thrive as well. They'd be outcompeted by weeds. They'd succumb to disease. You'd get like weaker plants growing. And if you think about that in terms of like a tomato or a pepper that's going to thrive under these conditions, and a tomato and pepper wouldn't necessarily do as well in the wintertime because they need those warmer months, longer sun, things like that. And if we go back to thinking about we're harvesting the leaves off of these plants, we sort of benefit from them slowing down their growth because we want to eat the leaves. We don't necessarily want them to go to set flowers and fruits and seeds like we do for a lot of your summer crops, like a tomato or a cucumber or something, where we do want to eat, want them to get pollinated, and we do want to eat the fruits and flowers off of those plants.
Interesting. So what are the limits of cold hardiness?
Yeah, so you can think about it in terms of maybe cold hardiness and frost tolerance, and those being two different things. So some plants can withstand cold temperatures, meaning like around freezing or just below freezing, and other ones can survive a slightly lower temperature than that. And most plants, when we're getting into below 25 degrees just outside, it's hard for any herbaceous plant, meaning a non-woody plant, to survive that at all. And that's why we have different ways that we sort of extend our season that help us to increase the life cycle of the length of the life cycle of those plants.
So you said extend the season. How do farmers and gardeners, what are some of the ways that farmers and gardeners extend seasons?
Yeah, so for season extension, we're sort of thinking about how do we bridge the gap between different major growing seasons. So between the end of the fall and the beginning of spring, what are some strategies that we can use as farmers and gardeners to help things continue to grow and longer? And we can go over a couple of those different things, and some of them are way more intensive than others. So one would just be to look at the varieties of crops that you're choosing, and you can look at different seed catalogs and different nurseries and stuff, and ask around and try to find different varieties of plants that are bred for lower temperatures and colder temperatures and less sunlight. And lettuce would be a good example of this, because you can find some lettuce varieties that are going to thrive in the summer or just be comfortable in the summer. And then you can also find ones that are going to be more cold hardy and can survive colder temperatures and less sunlight in the winter time. Another thing would be to pay attention to microclimates and wherever you're growing. And by microclimates, we just mean like different pockets of your growing space that might be warmer or colder than others. Like if you have like spots that might be lower on your property, or a place that's closer to a building that might be getting some ambient heat from a building or a different structure like that, and knowing where you might be able to eke out a few more degrees than other places that you might be growing things. Other methods would be mulching your plants to insulate them. So bare soil in general is not great for plants, and using mulch is going to help to stabilize the temperature in your soil. So that could be something like wood chips or leaves or grass clippings or something, and that can sort of insulate and help to your soil be able to retain heat more. And then also using row covers over your crops too, to kind of like insulate them a little bit and sort of tuck them in. You can think of it as like a blanket for your plants to help them stay a little bit warmer during the winter time. And then lastly, this is like the big thing that we would use on a farm would be something like a high tunnel, which is sort of like a greenhouse, but is not hooked up to electricity. So it's just a large tunnel that has plastic over it, and that can uses the power of the sun to help warm up the soil and air around the plants. And we can have some control with those where we can roll the sides up and down on them to help control the temperature, but really it's about capturing the heat energy from the sun and trapping that in an environment sort of like a greenhouse that helps to keep those plants warmer during the winter months.
Cool. Now, if you don't have room for a greenhouse on your property or in your classroom, what are some options?
Yeah, people build what's called a cold frame, where you can basically make that out of, if you can imagine like an old window or something like that, anything that's clear, that's going to be able to let energy from the sun get in and then trap the heat inside. So lots of folks build these off of the edges of their building, so they're capturing some of the heat from their building, and then you just build a box right outside of your building and then put a glass pane over the top of it, and that's going to basically act as like a mini greenhouse, and you can control the temperature in that by propping it open or shutting it when it's a little bit colder and opening it when it's a little bit warmer, so that you're letting some of the heat escape and not actually cooking those plants that prefer the colder temperatures.
Oh, that's great. And we're going to have a video. We're going to share a video showing one way of building a box. Okay. So what about storage crops?
Yeah, so storage crops, which we could also think of as winter vegetables, but that doesn't mean that they're actually growing in the winter, as opposed to the spinach and those things which could conceivably be grown in the winter. We're talking about plants that have been growing in the summer, and we're harvesting them in the late summer and fall, and then we're setting them aside in specific ways that allows us to enjoy them throughout the winter, and we're storing them. And this would be ways that people, before we had technology like refrigeration or other like preservation techniques like fermentation or pickling, these storage crops would be a way to allow your harvest to continue into the winter months.
Cool. And so what makes a good storage crop?
I think a good storage crop is one that you can hold it past its harvest date with minimal prep, meaning there's simple things you can do that are going to make these different crops last longer into the winter. And you can kind of think of them in how you're going to hold these crops in a couple different categories based on temperature and moisture, thinking of, do you want to store things cool or cold, dry or moist? And there's some crops you'll see specific recommendations for temperature and humidity level, but if you're close to where the recommendations are at, you're probably going to be okay. And an example of this would be storing crops in an unheated basement or an unfinished basement. That's not going to give you a specific temperature, but it's going to get you close to where you want to store a lot of your storage crops, like squash or apples or things like that.
Oh, cool. So what is curing?
Curing just means there's some steps that you're going to take before you put these vegetables into storage, and this is going to increase shelf life and flavor, and that's due to these plants are converting their starches that are in a lot of these vegetables. We're thinking of winter squashes, so your butternuts, your acorns, your kabocha squashes, and they're converting starches into sugar. And curing also helps to prevent damage to the outside of the crops that might occur during transportation or handling. So if you're harvesting sweet potatoes and you nick the outside of them with your tools, then curing is going to help to sort of heal that wound, and then it's going to store longer. And if you don't take the step to cure it, then that wound is going to become a problem later on, and that's where rot and disease are going to happen. So we're curing things like onions, squashes, potatoes, hard-skinned winter squashes, and those are going to require some period of time to dry out after harvesting before they go into the storage. And then there's other things like garlic that are going to need to dry out a lot in order to prevent them from rotting throughout the winter.
Okay, so how do you cure? Do plants have different curing processes?
Yeah, so plants have different curing processes, and some are really specific to what those individual crops are. So we'll put a link along with these resources to those vegetables rather than going through them all here. But you're going to have, generally speaking, you're going to have some sort of curing process, meaning after the harvest, you're letting the vegetable sort of sit and dry, and then for some period of time in a relatively like warm and dry area, and then you're gonna store that crop then in something that meets its requirements, whether that's like a cooler environment, a very cold environment, a very moist environment, or a very dry environment. And you can think about the different places in your house, for instance, or wherever you may live that can meet the different conditions. So like a cold and dry refrigerator, a cool and moist basement, and you can augment those things with fans, heaters, AC units to keep your temperature sort of stable and to keep air flowing around based on what these crops might need.
And so how long will storage crops last?
That's a great question.
How can growers plan for availability of crops?
Yeah, I think thinking about that question practically is a good way to go about it. Meaning, like, if you're looking up the squash that you've grown and it says it can store for 4 months, you maybe don't go in with the expectation that's going to last 4 months, and you should think more about, how am I going to make sure that none of this food goes to waste, and use it up, instead of really pushing the limits of storage time, and enjoy them while you can, rather than trying to wait out as long as possible. And part of that process would be to, like, check on your stored crops frequently. So if it says if you've cured it right, and you have a pumpkin that says it will last for 3 months, that doesn't mean you should wait for 3 months to check on it. You should be checking on it all throughout those 3 months, and paying attention to what's happening, and adjusting different factors that might be contributing to any sort of decomposition that might be occurring. And then similarly, thinking about selecting varieties that store better than others. So similarly with the cold weather crops, about looking for cold hardiness, you can also look for different storage crops that might be specially bred for storage, and you can do some research into which ones would meet those requirements for you. And then you can also think about storage crops beyond just the garlic, onions, winter squashes that we were talking about, and think about other things that you could categorize as a storage crop that you're actually drying completely out. And that could be something like dried beans that you're growing, different grains like corn or barley or things like that, and then also your herbs that you were growing throughout the summer, and those would be ones that you're completely dehydrating and drying out, and those would have a really long shelf life once you've gotten all the moisture out of them.
Cool. Know about crops and what makes them winter hardy or storage safe.
Yeah, there's a lot to go into that.
Yeah, I mean, we're lucky that these plants have adapted themselves to this climate so that we can store them and eat them. And it makes you think about, like, before all this technology that we have, how resourceful people must have been to figure out how to keep things warm so it keep growing, or preserve things.
Exactly. Thinking about something like a root cellar, for example, like a primitive like cooler or something like that. Yeah, great ways to be able to store your food for really long periods of time.
Yeah. So there is a video that we'll attach to the resource page when we put this up on our website that gives you some ideas about how to build a cold frame, and a bunch of other resources that will make sure people have access to about crops and how to know which ones are hardy and which ones are storage worthy. But for now, we are going to go think about some of these crops in terms of their culinary value to us. So let's head to the kitchen.
Hello. Good morning.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of our seasonal cooking demonstration. Eric and I, it's a cold January day, and so we went out to the farm stand to see what was available to cook. And we found quite a lot of food that is growing on the farm or has been preserved on the farm, and decided that using it all, we can make a really nice winter meal of a hearty soup and a delicious salad. So I just wanted to go over some of the things that we found and talk about what makes them cold hardy, or how it is that they're available for us to use at this time of year. So the first thing I've got here are some members of the brassica family. I have kale and cabbage. I might also have found Brussels sprouts or cauliflower or other leafy green that are like a tough leafy green that have a thick leaf, which gives the plants some protection from cold. But both of these will be great for our soup and our salad, the cabbage and the kale. Also in our farm stand, I found these root vegetables. So I've got sweet potatoes, carrots, and rutabagas. I might have found beets or what else might I have found in there? Potatoes, just regular potatoes. But these are going to be great. And then I also found parsley and dill, which are herbs that will grow pretty much year round, maybe not in the heat of summer, but in a greenhouse environment where they have a little protection from the cold. So I just wanted to point or offer some explanation for why the brassicas and the root vegetables are cold hardy or good storage crops, and that has to do, among other things, with their ability to convert the starch in their cells into sugar. And so one of the things that happens in the cold is that the water in the cells of plants, when it gets cold enough, will freeze, and then that will rupture the cell and damage the plant. So some plants have the capacity to, as the weather is cooling, to start converting their starches into sugar. And then the sugar water in the cell it has a lower freeze point. So the plant can tolerate more cold before the cells freeze and rupture and do damage to the plant. So that is one of the reasons that we have access to these plants so far into the season. Then I also found onions and garlic, which have been cured here on the farm. Curing, as you've heard earlier in the segment, is a process by which things dry, generally in some environment with a consistent temperature and a lot of air circulation. And what's happening to the onion and the garlic as it's drying is that these outer layers, when they're first harvested, they're very juicy. And over the course of that curing process, the outer layers dry out and turn papery. So they get this paper, these layers of protection from the paper skins. And also this part of the onion and the garlic clove or garlic head tighten up. And so they dry and they tighten so that the bulb is now protected. It's closed up so microbes can't get in and moisture can't get in. So that's an important piece of the curing process. And then let's see. So that is the fresh produce that we have access to. And right there we could produce a really nice pot of soup and or a salad. But that isn't all that we have at this time of year, because over the course of the growing season, there are lots of opportunities to set things aside and preserve things in some way that make them available to us at this time of year. So beans are a really good example of a preserved vegetable that is really productive during the summer. And now we can use it. We can just put it in the broth of our soup, or we can cook them and add them to salads to make the salad heartier and more nutritious. We've also got tomatoes, which have been canned, and I found these in my larder. And that's a great way to make tomatoes available all winter long. We've got pickles, which you can pickle almost any vegetable. We do a lot of that at the farmhouse. So these are cucumbers, and these could be really delicious in our salad. And then finally, you can jam things. You can make jams, which is uses sugar to preserve. So this is a caramelized onion jam, which I would use in my salad dressing. I think that would be a really nice addition. And then there's also all the dried herbs that are available all the time. And in the winter, we like to use things that are warming, like chili pepper or turmeric or allspice. And then finally, there's the freezing, things that you froze over the course of the growing season, which would include these vegetable ends. This is just a collection of leek, onion skins, just the ends of everything that I don't use when I'm cooking, that I freeze, and then I make a stock out of it. And then I think the final element of any delicious dish is that acid that you want to add to brighten and make the dish especially good. And so the acids that I have here are vinegar, which you can make and keep indefinitely because it's fermented product. Tomatoes are a really good source of acid, so I'll definitely be using those in my soup. And then citrus is a really wonderful acid, and I will be using the citrus in my salad dressing, and maybe a splash in the soup at the end of when it's done cooking. So this is what we have to work with, and the activity that we thought would be interesting for you to try in your classroom, we'll share this worksheet with you, is called a winter meal. And it asks your students to create a winter meal by making a soup and a salad with a selection of these cold, hardy, and storage and preserved crops. And so they can go through each of these categories and pick 1 to 3 items, and then compose a soup and a salad, and then maybe you can have a tasting to see which of the soups and salads you enjoy the most. So thanks so much for visiting the farm stand and kitchen with us, and I hope you have a wonderful, hearty winter eating season.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. All right. All righty.
Yeah, so that is the conclusion of our seasonal cooking winter episode. We hope you find these resources useful. They'll be up on the web shortly. The video, as well as the worksheets and some links to other useful resources. Our next virtual workshop is on February 9th, and it's on dairy farming. So I think that one's going to be really fun, and we're going to learn a lot. So we hope to see you there. In the meantime, have a wonderful winter season.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us.